Hello and welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will be discussing Masonic meetings on Zoom and some of the myths about them.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Tonight on the Working Tools Podcast, we're going to talk about sort of the meeting culture on Zoom and how meetings are going to work here in the near future, at least in Washington, and some of the myths about how it'll work, and maybe we'll touch on some other good stuff too. So we have with us today, I'll start on my left this time, Worshipful Brother Steven Chung of the out in Kelowna, BC, and the Grand Lodge of British Columbia in the Yukon. Right Worshipful Brother Trevor McKeown, who's the Grand Historian up in our brothers to the north. And I'm Very Worshipful Brother Matthew Appel. I'm just a guy here in Washington, a Mason in Washington. We have our usual fourth host. David is not available tonight. He's dealing with a family matter, and we wish him all the best in that, and we'll be praying for him and his family. But yeah, so we were discussing right before we started here, we were going to talk about something else entirely, and then all of a sudden we got interested in a new topic. So we're going to discuss a little bit about tiling meetings and masonry and Zoom meetings and that sort of stuff. So did you guys have questions, thoughts? Where were we going with that?
Well, I'm again it. Anything. I'm again it all.
I fear change.
It's interesting how I've found within myself, as I've aged, I've become more conservative. I'm sure this happens to most people. And I do not like the direction that it appears that Freemasonry is going in. And I don't know if I'm on the wrong side of history and I'm just a grumpy old man, or if I have a serious point to make about this. But I'll make my point and we'll see what happens. Several jurisdictions in North America are discussing how they can keep Freemasonry going during a pandemic. Interesting that we waited until the pandemic was almost over before we started discussing this. And I suggest that the pandemic is simply an excuse by those brethren who already are wanting us to allow meetings, tile meetings, ritual, voting, balloting, possibly conferral of degrees to be done online in video conference. And I'm again it. That's not Freemasonry to me. But I have to realize I'm a grumpy old man. And I remember 30 years ago, grumpy old men then who walked away from their lodge for no other reason than the brethren did a little historical research in one particular lodge and realized that the altar in their lodge shouldn't be in the middle of the room, but like emulation work in England, should be in the east. And the lodge voted, and they changed it. And 3 members, grumpy old men to a man, quit over the fact that that was no longer Freemasonry. So I always have that as a role model when I discuss things like this. But I really think, and I'm sorry to sort of overwhelm you two for a moment, I'll shut up in a moment. I really think we have to look, as we did in an earlier broadcast, the definition of words. Tiled. What does tiled mean? And many people say, oh, well, Zoom or whatever video conferencing software is secure. No one can spy on us. That's not my point. My definition of tiled is that we've gone into a space, taken 4 walls, we have done a magical incantation, and we have turned it into a temple. We have sealed that space. It is now a sacred space. To open the door, to punch a hole through it electronically, anything is to untile that space. And it's no longer Freemasonry. And that's pretty much all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Well, I don't know. When it comes to the way they're trying to do things, I commend the efforts, but I don't know that, I've already received the letter from the Grand Lodge of Washington, and somebody sent it to me and said what they were going to do, and I thought, well, it's interesting, and I commend them in their efforts to try and keep going, but though you wouldn't have ritual and your lodge would be deemed open, your ability to vote and conduct the business that needs to be conducted isn't really addressed in that, because, like Trevor was alluding to, the tiled lodge, right? And whether there's a lot of naysayers out there with respect to the security of Zoom, right? And that we could be eavesdropped on or, looked into by accountants and eavesdroppers while we're having our meetings. And I don't know enough about the technology to know whether it's secure enough or not, but I don't believe that we can actually properly conduct the business of a lodge in a virtual meeting, at least not without having some certainty of it being properly tiled.
Now, something we have done in British Columbia and Yukon, the Grand Master sent out several rulings on this, where what it sounds like you're considering in Washington State, we already permit, we just don't call it a lodge meeting, it's the Board of General Purposes. And if you want to have a board meeting and sit around on Zoom and say, okay, well, we still have to pay the rent and we still have to pay the secretary's honorarium and we still have to pay this charity we're committed to, so we have to collect dues. And you can get a consensus, you can take a straw poll, you can make a decision, is what we've told our lodges. All you have to do is keep a minute of that, so that the minute you get back, another meaning of the word minute, once you get back into a lodge room tiled, you will then vote to confirm decisions you made over the previous year.
Yes.
The Grand Master has essentially said that all lodges will be open on their stating meeting nights and their stated meeting times and their bylaws, and that they can do the businessy things, so reading the communications, issuing demits, education, charitable relief, etc. But they cannot do any of the esoteric work. They cannot ballot on petitions for degrees or affiliation, can't confer degrees, can't do the posting lecture, as I whack my microphone, can't do the posting lecture or any other esoteric things, which I think, as we were just saying, is a lot like the general purposes meetings that you guys do up north, that that David is so envious of, that allows essentially to allow the lodges to reconnect as lodges and to do the business of lodges without having to rely on that executive committee to make all the decisions.
Right, and I think you were mentioning that it's more, I think, an effort to get the lodges to reconnect themselves and moving forward. Like the lodges have been inactive now for over a year, and as you were saying, some of them aren't getting together on Zoom. So really, what are they doing, and how can we get them engaged again, right?
Right, and I was actually really surprised by that some lodges aren't doing anything. So our lodge, when we stopped meeting in person, literally we started having weekly meetings so we were meeting more often, and even if it was just a Zoom, it wasn't a real meeting, it wasn't a business meeting, but at least we were getting together saying, hey, how you doing? Everybody okay? Kind of thing. And we've actually tapered off a little bit since then to doing it every other week or monthly, depending on what's going on. So it's sort of interesting in my mind that there are lodges, like I said, in the area here where they've had like one Zoom meeting so far or none. And I would really like to see those lodges. Maybe I'm wrong and they're doing something else heroic that I'm not aware of, which is entirely possible. But it seems like there should be something out there that your lodge should be doing.
I heard everything that happens in Washington goes past your window.
Exactly. Wait a minute.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that. I know that in our district, District 9, there's 2 lodges that are doing things on Zoom, and they're both in Kelowna. So all the other 6 lodges out towards Revelstoke aren't doing anything that way. And down in District 10, where I think there's maybe 5 or 6 lodges, they're having their one of them, Peachland 56, has just started having their Board of General Purpose meetings once a month, to get together, if you will, which is great. I mean, there's been a lot of guys down there. They still were going for coffee. They were doing all the rebellious stuff. But if you ever looked at the activity calendar for District 10 in the past, I think every meeting was a coffee meeting except a lodge night. And the calendar was full of them. It's like they must all be retired or something, because they're all doing coffee every day, right? And then if it wasn't a lodge one, there's the Eastern Star coffee one. Then there's the Shriner coffee meeting. And then, so I think they were still getting together the best they could, doing social distancing at the coffee shops when they were still allowed and whatnot. But being on Zoom, it wasn't high on their list. And it came to be more prevalent when the district deputy grand masters were wanting to do their visits, because I don't know about down in Washington, but usually in our jurisdiction, the district deputy grand master's lodge that he's representing hosts the district deputy's official visit, and usually the grand master's official visit to that district. However, like in our case, our district deputy grand master's worshipful master is anti-Zoom and anti-online stuff, right? So couldn't get anybody to organize something like that. They haven't been doing it, so nobody's in touch with it, right? And if you started going around, that's when we realized that nobody else is doing it either. So we've actually created a virtual District 9 lodge made up of, the officers are made up of the various lodges, so that we can have at least one virtual official visit for our district deputy grand master. And we'll also be able to now have one virtual lodge for the grand master's official visit to the district too.
These meetings, of course, have no actual ceremony or ritual, and
Right.
opening, closing, passing of words, anything of that nature. So
Yeah.
we're using the language, and I think that can be a little confusing, if not deceptive, when we talk about having an online lodge when it's not really a lodge. We all understand, but maybe we don't all understand.
Right. Good point.
Which brings me back to what's happening in Washington, and far be it that we should comment on what's happening in another jurisdiction. It hasn't stopped us before. The language creates in practice much the similar situation as we have up here, but the language in my mind is a thin wedge that potentially leads to further change, because there are those brethren who would like to see everything done online, don't understand why we can't, because they run their businesses online and they run their social lives online. They met their wives online, that's that demographic. And I see potential changes to your constitution in Washington that would allow tiled meetings online. Seems to be the intent of some of the language that I've been reading about. And there's been similar, not so much discussions, but conversations in this jurisdiction along the same lines. And every baby step we take leads us into a scary future where I may not view it as being Freemasonry anymore, and that concerns me. There's two issues, or two questions. One is lodges and the other is grand lodges. And what is being pushed for in this jurisdiction is to allow Grand Lodge to be called online so that we can actually receive reports, have discussions, I guess, but vote on receiving reports and vote on constitutional amendments, ballot on candidates for the Grand. We generally only elect for the junior Grand Warden. And those who are promoting that are those people who pretty much live online already, swear that it's perfectly secure and safe, and don't get my argument, or don't accept my argument, or don't feel it's an overwhelming one, that it's just simply not tiled. But that seems to be sort of the direction we're moving in.
I'm afraid of that. You know, I understand that there's a push for Grand Lodge to happen this year, whether it's virtual or in person because COVID's over. I think that even if COVID is over, I think that every Grand Lodge officer is being deprived of the experience of a full term in his office. I've never been a district deputy and been received in the lodges in a formal fashion, but I've been part of a lot of them, and I've observed a lot of them. And in observing it, I can see how heartwarming it is for a lot of the guys to be received by their peers and to be appreciated. And, you know, just because things are virtual, and these guys are not getting that this year. And I think it would be a crying shame for them to be out of the position and you know, yeah, sure, they get the title, they get the apron and all that, but they're not getting that experience. And I think that that's the best part of it. And I think it's a crying shame.
So that's an argument for retaining officers for another year, which is part of this discussion. But when we're talking about tiled meetings, when we're talking about having an annual communication online. So one of the arguments for doing this, or for having lodge meetings, and you touched on this, Matthew, is that we extend the franchise. We grow democracy. Everyone gets to participate, whether they can make it to lodge or not. I don't want to come across as being anti-democratic, but I have seen too many lodges frozen in time because there was a handful of brethren who didn't come out to meetings, didn't participate, except when it was that one vote that they felt strongly about where they were going to change the dues or the meeting night or whatever. And suddenly a whole bunch of people who can't be bothered to actually turn up for a meeting will come into Zoom and vote and impose their will on those of us who are actually there doing something.
Oh,
that's the other side.
You never see as many people at lodge as the night you vote to raise your dues. That'll get them all out of the woodwork.
And you'll never see them for another until you do it again.
Yep, exactly. It's what were we just talking about? Oh, now I'm doing that thing right.
Important to us.
What's that?
Democracy is important to us, and I get that, but to those who aren't actually going to be affected by that, you know, they're not actually coming out to meetings, they're not actually getting involved. Should they be entitled to have that vote just because we now have the technology to allow them to?
And it's interesting. There actually are, at least that I know of, 2 online lodges that exist online. There's a Castle Island Virtual Lodge, which I think is out of Manitoba, I believe. I want to say it's a Grand Lodge in Manitoba. And there's Endeavour Virtual Lodge out of the state of Victoria down in Australia. And they exist online. That is all they are. I think
do they not have physical meetings to deal with officers, elections, or whatever?
I think they operate under certain restrictions from their Grand Lodges, but I don't exactly know enough about it to speak intelligently about it. I know that they have Castle Island, for instance. There's another. I don't want to shock anyone, but there are other Masonic podcasts out there, and one of the guys from one of these other podcasts, which I'll remain nameless, lives in Ohio, and he is I want to say senior deacon for this lodge in Manitoba. And they've had guys there from like Italy and that sort of stuff that are their officers, and so there must be some dispensation there for them to conduct a certain amount of business From what I understand, there is restrictions on, like, they can't do degrees. The degrees have to be in person, but that pretty much everything else, like I said, I shouldn't talk because I don't know enough about it to talk intelligently. But there are restrictions, but other than that, they do exist solely online.
Well, there are two lodges I'm aware of. Internet Lodge out of England, and I cannot remember the number, has members all around the globe. It's been around for over 20 years. It may have been the first Internet Lodge, but they also have at least once, maybe a couple of times a year, a physical meeting where they install and elect their officers. They don't do anything that would be tiled online. Mm-hmm. It's all education and socializing that they do online. There's also an Internet Lodge in Alberta, which I believe operates much the same way.
Interesting. Yeah, I got to go to one of the Castle Island meetings once, and it was weird because I was attending on my phone in my car. And is this really a tiled space? I'm not quite sure, but I was assured that it was okay. So I'm okay. But it was, essentially they had a bare minimum of business at the beginning of the meeting, and they had a speaker there who I was interested in hearing speak. So I went essentially for the Masonic education, and there was, I think the only other thing they did was vote on a petition for affiliation. But it was interesting. It was just being at a lodge meeting, but not. It was very odd.
Well, it's a thin wedge to disaster. Can't be
a camel's nose under the tent. Yeah. So yeah, it's a different. So Masons as a rule are, as Trevor said earlier, are conservative, maybe not politically necessarily, but certainly dispositionally, small c conservative, if you will. We try to use the exact same words that in our ritual that were used 100 years ago. And if you want to change those words, you've got to get a 90% vote of a bunch of grumpy old guys. And, we tend to be conservative in that way. And so there's a part of me that, like you said earlier, Trevor, hates to see preserving things in amber for questionable reasons. But on the other hand, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some happy medium in there somewhere. And I don't know that anyone's figured it out yet. So it's other than my way. My way, of course, is exactly correct. So.
Yeah. Well, this virtual visiting is kind of cool and whatnot, but I still miss lodge. I still miss, shaking my brother's hand and getting the pat on the shoulder and doing that work live. I miss that.
I agree. I know there are studies out there that show that physical presence and hugging somebody and shaking their hand is whatever serotonin and all those feel good chemicals in your brain just by meeting someone face to face that you just don't get this way. No offense, guys, but it's just different. It is, and it's different in important ways.
And on that note.
Exactly. And on that note, I hope you all enjoyed our conversation here this evening on the Working Tools podcast. So on behalf of Steve and Trevor and myself and the absent David, thank you for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye.